Hi everyone, welcome back to another video review. Today we are reviewing Resident Evil Village. If you don't know me, my name is Delilah, aka Assassina-san. Welcome to my channel. And if you've been here, welcome back and thank you so much for coming back. Listen y'all, Capcom is one of the only developers at this point that can release a game annually and still get me hyped for the next one. That hype didn't die with Resident Evil Village. It lived up to that legacy that Capcom's been on since Resident Evil 7 in 2017. I had an absolute blast playing the sequel, and I'm very curious to see what's gonna happen in the next game. Resident Evil Village is hands down one of my favorite games of 2021, but it still has a handful of issues, as most games tend to have. I love Resident Evil games so much, and I really don't require more than a horrific environment, an eerie sound design, and gameplay that persistently makes me feel tense. And in Resident Evil Village, I got that in more ways than I imagined. The RE engine does not disappoint. It's still absolutely gorgeous with amazing lighting and so many details that I probably would have finished the game a lot faster if I didn't stare at like carpets and designs on a wall for too long and taking a lot of screenshots. It wasn't just the finite details, but seeing the giant Demetres castle in the distance was kind of like seeing Dracula's castle in Castlevania, and it's absolutely breathtaking. I'm a total sucker for the European Gothic settings in games like Castlevania and Bloodborne, so I was excited to explore this massive castle. And like many other people, the marketing of this game made me very curious about Lady Demetresque and her 3 daughters who dwelled in the lavish castle among a village littered with werewolves and lycans. When I first arrived to the village, seeing the castle in the distance excited me to no end, but then when I finally entered the castle, my jaw dropped at every corner, looking at all the golden sequins and dark wood, chandeliers, intricate wine glasses, and so much more. I couldn't get enough of the castle, and I imagined something so big would lead to a healthy chunk of exploration, but it actually ended sooner than I was ready for. I wanted more castle, and I wanted more Demetresque. I couldn't get enough of the castle. I was so excited to explore it before the game, and as I entered the game, I got even more excited, and that excitement only persisted the deeper I got into the castle, but unfortunately, it ended sooner than I was ready for. The minute that I exited the castle, the world opened up, and I was given access to more areas within and around the village. I was introduced to more players, as Lady Demetresque and her castle are just one of 4 areas to encounter one of 4 lords. I was pretty upset about this until I arrived to the second area, which is a lone house on a hill by a waterfall that provided one of the scariest experiences I've ever had in a horror game, period. At this point, I was on a high and ready to see the other 2 areas besides the castle and the Beneviento house, which is what it's called. And then, unfortunately, the game took a dip and did not stick the landing. It's not that the rest of the game absolutely dragged out for me, it just wasn't as strong as the first half. Whereas Resident Evil 7, in the beginning of the game, I absolutely loved exploring the Baker house and learning about the Baker family, but then once we got to that ship section, it kind of took a dip for me, and I was just kind of rushing through it and ready for the game to be over. There was no point in Resident Evil Village that I wanted the game to hurry up and be over, but I just wish that we had maybe gotten more of the castle and less of the latter 2 areas, especially the last area called Heisenberg's Factory. Together though, they did absolutely feel like an amusement park of horror, which is what Capcom said they were going for in this game. The first 2 being absolutely amazing, and the latter 2 being simply okay. Now that I've had time to process my experience with this game, I definitely understand why they decided not to just focus on the castle, because then it could have easily fell into a rinse and repeat of Mr. X or Nemesis in Resident Evil 2 and 3. So this definitely gave us the opportunity to mix things up a bit, because Lady D does stalk you like Mr. X, but in the other sections, you have threats that approach you differently. Shifting to these different sections that play differently, that look differently, definitely provided a more varied and refreshing gameplay experience, but I kind of wish the castle section was longer and subsequent areas shorter. But in between these 4 sections that are adjacent to the central village, is so much to discover and explore. There are treasures, locked doors that you have to find keys to, animals to hunt, and there are even some special hidden animals that can only be discovered if you find the picture reviewing its location. It'll give you a hint to its location, and these animals are used for recipes at the merchant called the Duke, which upgrades your max health and reduces damage when blocking. The best part about exploring is that when you revisit places that you previously encountered, you'll have new enemies to face. For example, to unlock the treasure at the Beneviento grave, which is right outside of the Beneviento house, I needed to find a stone slab that is only accessible in the center of the village after you complete the Beneviento house section. Then you'll have to backtrack to bring the stone slab to the grave and unlock the treasure. But right before you unlock the treasure, a big giant Aureus mini boss will jump in with a giant axe or hammer and will defend the treasure before you're rewarded. There are really some amazing set pieces, hidden puzzles, and optional mini bosses to encounter upon exploration, and they require a healthy amount of backtracking. You'll come back to the village many times throughout the game as it's the central location, and all of the new encounters are absolutely amazing. The village even looks different after you finish the third section of the game, because in the beginning of the game, it's as if it's during daytime, there's an overcast, it's foggy, it's white, it's full of snow, and then later the village is enveloped in a setting sun. So here I was able to gawk at the Demetres castle one more time as it was in the distance in a setting sun. Please, if you're one of those people who mainlined this game and just did the story and didn't backtrack at all, didn't experience the alpha werewolf or any of the other mini bosses, or go for the treasures, or find some hidden gems for the necklace that you could sell at the Duke, and other quirky little hidden things in this game, please go back, because that's truly where this game's magic is. So I clearly enjoyed exploring the village and even inside of the Demetres castle and House Beneviento. They were an absolute joy and I wanted more. Unfortunately, Maru's reservoir felt very linear and Heisenberg's factory is the most boring section and was way too long. I liked how unique each of these 4 sections were, but unfortunately after you complete a section, you can't go back into that section. There's no backtracking within the sections like there is in the village. You can go to areas outside of the sections like the vineyard of the castle or the grave of the Beneviento house, but that's about it. It would have been cool to have to go back into the castle to fight a new boss, or to find a new treasure, a new hidden item, or complete a different puzzle, or maybe even open up a completely new area that you couldn't open up when you first visited the castle. Basically, I just wanted these areas to be accessible in the same way that the village was, and to have the same amount of exploration that the village provided. I feel like this level of openness and backtracking would have contributed to an improved connectivity for the entire map, which is also helpful for backtracking to pick up missed collectibles. I think Resident Evil Village would have been a lot stronger if we could have freely explored all of the 4 sections in addition to the village, instead of being locked out completely. And of course, we can't talk about a Resi game without talking about puzzles. The puzzles in this game are very similar to previous Resident Evil games, like finding an item, examining it to take out a specific piece of it and put it into a door to unlock it, or finding a specific key and backtracking to a door that you couldn't open previously, that kind of thing. But I did feel like in comparison to other Resident Evil games, these puzzles were a bit too simple, and it was also something that Resident Evil 7 suffered from, with the exception of maybe the happy birthday puzzle. I think Resident Evil Village could have benefited from more puzzles, or at least a few more complex puzzles. And also, like other Resident Evil games, the gameplay starts more tense and horrific and eerie and feels more like a survival horror, but towards the end things ramp up and becomes more action focused. By the end, you'll likely have most of your weapons upgraded, like the pistol, the shotgun, the magnum, the grenade launcher, and just a bigger arsenal as combat gets more intense. In Resident Evil Village, I would say the combat starts to ramp up when you hit the Lycan stronghold right before you're about to head to Heisenberg's factory. Even though the beginning felt more tense and more like a survival horror, I felt like I always had a lot of ammo, and even when I ran out, I could either craft it or buy it at the merchant. So in that way, I kind of would have preferred the more survival survival elements to a survival horror game. But even though I tend to prefer more survival-based horror, I still found the action sections to be pretty fun. Sticking to the combat a bit, one of my main complaints about Resident Evil 7 is a lack of enemy variety, where you only pretty much had the Baker family and like 5 variants of the mold. In Resident Evil Village, there's so much variety, and each of the 4 sections have a unique set of enemies and bosses. And they're not just simply giant mutated blobs that you have to destroy weak points on the blob. You're given several distinct versions of Lycans, Moraika, if I'm saying that right, Samka, Haulers, Soldats, Urias, and the Demetres daughters. And of course the 4 Lauds, Lady Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Maru, and Donna. Even within enemies that were of the same type, they came in different sizes and wielded different weapons. The variety of enemies made combat an absolute joy, even in the more boring sections like the Heisenberg factory. Having these 4 sections with the 4 lords and different enemy variety made the gameplay feel extremely refreshing. It made it not drag out, it made it not feel repetitive, which I love. But unfortunately, it made the story and the lore feel very disjointed. Felt as though the sections were designed first to create this theme park of horror, and their connections to the bigger Resident Evil story felt secondary. The story is filled with plot holes that answer some of the questions from Resident Evil 7 and how it connects to the bigger Resident Evil universe, but then it created even more questions. Some of the backstory of what happened to these 4 lords or some of the other characters we meet in Resident Evil Village are explained through notes, so make sure you read and get as many collectible notes as you possibly can to have a better understanding of what's happening and a clearer understanding of the motivations of the enemies that you face. But I do feel like some of the things that went down maybe could have been avoided with a conversation or two. Without giving spoilers, some of the elements introduced into the series make things more convoluted than they ever were before. Having the 4 lords definitely contributed to great gameplay, but I just kind of wanted more time with them and to get to know who they were before shit went down. Kind of like in the same way I got to know the Baker family, but I think having so many more players with different backgrounds in Resident Evil Village versus one small family that felt very micro definitely made the story and the lore feel a lot more disjointed than I would have liked. So if you're looking to get some fulfilling lore and story from Resident Evil Village, you may be disappointed with the writing. But then again, these games tend to not take themselves seriously, so perhaps we'll just accept it. And I do want to quickly talk about Mercenaries Mode, which is a free mode included with Resident Evil Village in efforts to add content to justify the $60 price point, kind of like how they had that multiplayer mode in Resident Evil 3, except it wasn't as good. Mercenaries Mode is definitely good. And we're also getting Reverse, which is a multiplayer mode that hasn't been added to Resident Evil Village yet because they're still working on it, but we're gonna get that for free as long as we have the game. And maybe I'll talk about it once we finally get our hands on it. So in Mercenaries Mode, you go back to the 4 areas, the castle, the factory, and different parts of the village that are filled with a bunch of different enemy types that you encountered in the main game, but you're also given kind of bigger versions of the enemies that you did not encounter in the main game, which I thought was really, really cool. You're given a limited amount of lei, which is the currency in this game, and an arsenal to choose from to get through it. But you're timed in this mode, so the main goal is to chain kills back to back to get a multiplier to give you a higher score, and to find these orbs that increase your time and give you different perks. And Mercenaries Mode, it starts off pretty easy, but then when you get to the last 4 areas, it definitely ramps up and gets harder, which was a welcome challenge. But I didn't like that I had to turn off my DualSense features in order to get through the last 4 areas of Mercenaries Mode successfully. It was still a lot of fun though, kind of a pain in the ass towards the end, and especially when I had to go to the factory, I was already tired of that place by the time I got to at the end of the village story, and then having to go back to it for Mercenaries Mode was a little annoying, but you know, it's a free extra mode that's completely optional, and I quite enjoyed it for the most part. So in summary, the first half of Resident Evil Village is an absolute gem, providing the eerie, intense environment that I look for in these types of games. If it wasn't for the second half of this game being less interesting than the first half, then it probably would have been my favorite Resident Evil game, period. But even still, it crawled its way up to my top 5 Resident Evil games and is definitely one of my favorite games of 2021. So that's it. Let me know your thoughts on Resident Evil Village. Agree with me, disagree with me, did I miss anything? Anything you want to add or anything that you feel like I said was stupid, that I shouldn't have said, let me know in the comments. Do what you gotta do. So I hope you guys like these, and thank you so much for watching, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.